I've been muted this whole time. Uh, how can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it was muted. Uh,
I'm in a courtroom, apparently.
apparently, your sons do that for their school.
Yes, they do. I don't remember how to change it.
Don't worry about it. Okay, so we're trying to use some new software so that we can get the Bible verses up and y'all can see the questions and all those things. So it's going to be a bit of a rough ride tonight, but we'll make it through. So you change the background by clicking on your little video thing, and it says choose virtual background. You can just keep it there. It makes you look official. Well, you turn the video off. If you hover over the video, there's a little arrow. Okay, all right. Okay, so let's start asking this question. It's been called a bunch of different things throughout history. It's been called the Lord's Supper. It's been called communion. Those are the two names that you see primarily used in the text of Scripture, depending on the translation that you have. You'll also hear it called Eucharist every once in a while. And that comes from the word thanksgiving in the text. And so Christians originally saw it as a meal of thanksgiving, and so they applied that word to it, the Eucharist, and that's where that comes from. And so all three of those things you'll hear applied to what we call the Lord's Supper, and it's typically something that Christians, at least in our memory, have been coming together to do, right? I mean, have you ever, I can't remember, aside from these stay-at-home orders, any time where Christians have not, in the United States, been able to gather together as they wished to take the Lord's Supper. Can you think of anything? I can't. Yeah, it's what we're used to.
That we can say that.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's not like some instances today in other places. Recently, I think in the past few years or so, Christianity has again become the most persecuted religion in the world, and so that's something outside of my experience, but that's a daily reality for some people, that it's difficult to gather in groups. Well, now it's, depending on where you live, you violate ordinances if you gather in groups above a certain size. And so you're limited, and you wind up staying at home or staying some other place where you're not going to violate the rules that are in place, at least temporarily. Well, that causes us then to ask the question about meeting together. Can we take the Lord's Supper at home? Is it something that we can do at home in a small group, or is it something that can only happen at a church building? Or, to ask another kind of different question, is it only something that can happen when an entire local church is gathered together? Do those make sense? Why those might be two separate questions? Because one might see that one might see the church building as like a special place, and the other one is just, well, does it have to be the whole group together? So what we've got pulled up is the text from Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 26. And it is we can call it the institution of the Lord's Supper, or the time where Jesus is with his disciples, and he tells them some things. He pulls them or draws them out of the Passover meal. So let's read in Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 26. It says, "Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body.' And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom.'" So this is, again, what we can call the institution of the Lord's Supper. This is the first time that Jesus does something like this. Up until this point, the elements of the Passover have simply been that. They've been the elements of the Passover, a feast which God commanded, all the way back in Exodus 12. Maybe that may be a connection that a lot of people don't make, that the Lord's Supper is coming out of the Passover meal, when we see that, Jesus would say over in Matthew chapter 5, if you remember, people were accusing Jesus of undoing the law, right? He's arguing against Moses. He's arguing against everything that the Jews had been doing, at least in their minds, and things that maybe that made up Judaism. Do you remember what Jesus says about the law? What did he say he was going to do over in Matthew chapter 5? Fulfill it, yeah. So let's take a look at that. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So this institution of the Lord's Supper in what we're seeing in Matthew chapter 26, coming out of the Passover meal, so the Lord's Supper seems to be the fulfillment of this Passover meal, or at least the Passover meal has been pointing us to this idea all along. So Jesus doesn't come along and say, hey, the Passover thing, we're not doing that anymore. He fulfills it. Right? He himself.
It's so amazing when you realize that. It's so amazing. Sorry.
Yeah, it's really cool that all along God has been getting us ready for what Jesus shows us in Matthew chapter 26. Well, to help us understand what's going on, it would probably be a good idea to go look at when the Passover is instituted. So if we turn over to find that, we're going to have to go to Exodus chapter 12. And there's a lot going on in Exodus chapter 12. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the things that are happening, but we're not going to look at absolutely everything that is happening because some of it Jesus doesn't do. It's not applicable at his time anymore. So if you go over to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 1, it says, "The Lord said to Moses and to Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the house is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of people. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb." So here is the meal that they're having, the institution, the original institution of the Passover meal. And what's interesting is when you look at the institution of the Passover, who did it, right? The whole nation of Israel was taking the Passover, but at what level was the Passover implemented? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So it says for a household.
Yeah, a household.
A lamb for a household. Yeah.
Right. And you see this over in the account in Matthew chapter 26. Jesus and his disciples, just 12 of the disciples, they go somewhere and those 13 people eat a Passover meal together. Jesus has many disciples at this point, but he doesn't invite all of the disciples to go eat the Passover with him. There's just a small number. And so when we look at the Exodus 12, when we look at the institution of the Passover itself, it isn't, it is something that the whole nation is doing together, but it's something that the whole nation is doing in their homes. It's according to a household. And so it's not something that you have to get all the people in a town together to do. It's something that you do with your family, and somebody else is going to do with their family, and somebody else does with their family, and all of that is in the context of the whole family of Israel doing it at the same time. Right? So they all do it on the same day, they do it at the same time, and they do the same thing. And in that sense, because there's all those similarities, we could say that all of Israel is doing it together. Right? Even though they're in separate places, all of Israel is fulfilling or taking the Passover together at the level that God implemented it. Well, that's interesting because that's exactly what we see Jesus doing in Matthew 26. He doesn't take all of the disciples. He takes a small number of the disciples. About as many could eat a lamb and have the meal and do what it is that Jesus does with his disciples there. And then when you go over to Acts chapter 2, which is the next time that you see the Passover or the Lord's Supper discussed, is really probably Acts chapter 2. And so in Acts chapter 2, it says, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and prayers." Now that phrase, breaking of bread, what does that make you think of when you hear that? When you say, come over to my house and we'll break bread together, what do you mean?
Think of eating,
Yeah, that's all it means.
just eating in general.
That's all it means. And so if it means something extra, like if it was going to refer to a very particular kind of meal, the context kind of has to tell you that. Otherwise, it just means to eat. And so it says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, and to eating and the prayers. Well, I mean, I don't know if potlucks were a thing in the first century, but it seems like we're going to be talking about special food here because it's the apostles' teaching, right? It's not just random teaching. It's a fellowship. It's a special kind of connection that these people have with one another. And the prayers, they're being devoted to something, a special time that's being set aside. So it seems like all of these things that are mentioned, the apostles' teaching, their fellowship with one another, their prayers, all of these things have a religious connotation. And so it would be really weird to have religious thing, yeah, just food, religious thing. So it seems like in Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, the thing being talked about there would be some kind of special religious meal or religious type of eating. Does that make sense? Okay, so it seems like that's what's going on there. I can't tell you like with absolute certainty because Luke doesn't say to the breaking of bread, and by breaking of bread, I mean precisely this. But I think when you look at here, the context of how it's being used, you look at the way that that same phrase will be used in other places, you look at what happens in other places of the biblical text, where the church does come together, groups of people come together to take the Lord's Supper or communion or however we describe that event. And just in history, historically, people have understood this passage. The earliest Christians have understood this passage, not to talk about just eating together, just like a regular meal, but they saw this as a special meal where the people of God, the family of God, was coming together to do something special with each other.
Well, isn't that kind of what Paul would be talking about in 1 Corinthians when he says, don't you have houses to eat in? Like if you're just going to have a regular meal, it's just like your little party, just kind of a casual thing. You can do that at home. But here, when we come together, we're doing this for a purpose, a spiritual purpose, and we don't want to leave anybody out. Like, let's do it together. If we're going to do it together, let's do it together. This
Right.
is a spiritual thing. We're not just having a casual meal. Isn't that kind of what he's alluding to?
I think it is. Yeah, when you look over, we'll just flip over there real quick and then we'll come back to Acts 2. When you look over in, here we go. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 17. So he's just given some instructions, and now he says that in this, what I'm telling you about now, you're not doing a good thing. When you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. So whatever he's about to describe, it's not good for them. He says, in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you. Well, we see at the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he talks about various divisions. Some say I'm of Peter, some say I'm of Paul, others say I'm of Jesus. And now he says, when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you. A lot of people, it's kind of confusing the way that he describes things. What does it mean for them to assemble as an assembly? What does that mean? I don't know, but I mean, that's kind of what the text says. When you assemble yourselves together as an assembly, I don't know what that means, right? That's difficult. And so some people have suggested that when you look at the way the church kind of operated, and you can see that both in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and places like Romans chapter 16, later here in 1 Corinthians, where it talks about like people meeting together, like in Romans 16, it'll say the church that meets in Ananias and Sapphira's, not Ananias and Sapphira. I'm drawing a blank. Who are the tent makers?
Now that you said that,
I know. I can't believe I can't remember their names. Anyway, there's some people. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, there's Chloe's people. And it seems like it's a church that meets in Chloe's house. What? Prisca and Aquila, or Aquila and Priscilla. It uses both. Their house, right? There's a church that meets in their house. And so and that's amid or among the discussion of the church at Corinth, the church at Rome. And so what does it mean, right? It's confusing because apparently in the first century, Paul didn't feel the need to delineate precisely what he means because the disciples who were doing this knew. But now when we come back 2,000 years later almost, and we read it, we have to realize that we're kind of bringing 2,000 years of cultural baggage with us when we read this text. And many people, when they read 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 18, and it says, when you come together as a church, they have a lot of different ideas about what that phrase means based upon their religious culture. And so if you were Catholic, per se, then you would see this as meaning that when we go to a particular place, right, we are going to the church, and it is at this particular place, it is a sacred and holy place where somebody, an ordained official of the church, will transform will make this common bread and this common drink into something holy. There are many religious groups that have that kind of understanding, right? The Catholic Church would be one, the Roman Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Coptic Church, the Ethiopian Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, right? So there's all these different religious traditions that would hear these words that way. There's other ways to hear it. And so our struggle is to hear this the way that the Christians in the first century would have heard it. Is Paul saying that everybody in the Corinthian region came together in one place? Or was it those house churches, those smaller groups, right? Whatever phrase you want to use to describe it, they didn't necessarily have to meet in somebody's house. Somebody's house might mean their family, it might mean their place. When these smaller groups were coming together, instead of all the Christians in Corinth when they were coming together. Well, now to kind of answer that, if we go again back to Exodus 12, the Passover originally takes place in families, in houses, in households. Then when you go to Acts chapter 2 to look at what's going on there, we can look down in verse 46. So we see that they've devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, the breaking of bread, the prayers. And then you look in verse 46 and it says, and day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. And so what you see is if in verse 46 you have an elucidation or maybe a explanation of what is going on in verse 42, you see the early church meeting house to house. Right? So they're coming together and they're meeting in people's homes. Why might they do that? Why might the saints in Jerusalem not be gathering together in one giant group to take the Lord's Supper? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Maybe it's not practical.
Why wouldn't it be practical? I think you're right. I think right on the nose. But why wouldn't it be practical?
I didn't experience, attending the temple, but I'm thinking that with, trying to be, have everyone have a meal there would be a difficult task.
Look in verse 41. Do you have your Bible open?
Yeah.
Yeah, look in verse 41. I couldn't see it, so I was...
Oh, so those are super good questions. Oh, okay. 3,000?
3,000 people, right? And that's the first day. And so you're going to see the church there. The church is continuing to grow. I don't know how you would do, right? I mean, without a building to meet in, like that's specially designed to accommodate 3,000 people. I don't know how you would do, right, like a Lord's Supper type scenario with 3,000 people, right, in a way that could happen at the temple or someplace, within the city. It makes much more sense for this big group of people to go into smaller groups, house to house, and meet together, very much like in Exodus chapter 12. So a Hebrew person, seeing that the Lord's Supper comes out of the Passover meal, they would think, oh, well, we eat the Passover at home, right? All of Israel eats the Passover together, but we eat the Passover at home. And so when it comes time to eat the Lord's Supper, I don't think a Hebrew person would say, "Oh, we have to all be together in one place or we're not taking the Lord's Supper." A Hebrew person would probably say, "Oh, well, I mean, we ate the Passover at home, so we'll just eat the Lord's Supper at home." And that seems to be what's taking place. Now, it very well could be that over in the passage you mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, it could be that there people are coming together as a bigger group. So what does that tell us? If that's what's going on, right? Again, there's that nebulous phrase. What does it mean precisely to assemble together as an assembly? This is one of those places where I wish that I could call Paul and say, hey, can you clarify that? But that's what you get. It could mean that there was a larger group of people coming together. Maybe they did. Maybe all the Christians in Corinth, maybe there weren't as many, and so maybe all the Christians in Corinth did come together. These are Gentile Christians. There's many more Gentile Christians here than there was in that Jerusalem church. There were none there. And so maybe now the Gentiles figure, well, I mean, we can come together, so we just will. We'll all come together in one big group, and we'll do this together. And Paul says, now when you come together in one big group, you still can't split yourself up. Right? If you're going to stay separated, then eat at home. But if you're going to come together to do this, then you need to all be together and you need to all be doing it together. And so it would seem like...
Just as you would do.
Go ahead.
As you would do if you were a small group, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Carry that to the big group too.
Right. So it would be weird if we invited some friends over to our house and said, y'all go wait out on the back porch while we eat supper, and then you can come in when we're done, right? That would be weird. But that's it seems, that's kind of what was happening here, is they were meeting together and people weren't waiting, or they didn't like other people, and so they excluded them, and Paul is saying, hey, you can't do that. Because if that's how you're doing this, then when you come together, you're really not together. And so it looks like in the text of Scripture, we have both. It looks like we have people meeting in their homes, and it looks like perhaps we have a larger group, what we might think of today more like a local church, like the people in a bigger area coming together to take the Lord's Supper together. So if both of those things are happening, what does it tell us? If in the text of Scripture we see both events happening, what does it tell us about the two options? Can you take the Lord's Supper at home, or do you have to take it in a full assembly? What is the answer?
Looks like they're both acceptable, right?
Yeah, it looks like they would both be acceptable. Now, my preference is what I think we see in 1 Corinthians 11, where you have a bigger group of people coming together. I mean, if you can do it with a bigger group of people, that seems the best thing to me, right? That would be my opinion. But I can't say that under certain circumstances, like in Acts chapter 2, it seems like it's just the logistics that causes them, or maybe it's just the way that they heard it and understood it. Well, we took the Passover at home, so we're going to take the Lord's Supper at home too. It could be that there's just too many people to do it all in one place. I don't know. But it seems like that both would be okay. There is no place in the New Testament where we are ever told that you have to have this many people in order to take the Lord's Supper, or where we are specifically told the Lord's Supper can only take place when you have decided to come together as a large group. Now, the problem with that, with either being okay, the problem with that is that we have to figure out as a local body of believers what we're going to do. Right? And one of the things that you see in the New Testament is that the Lord has put shepherds in place to kind of help guide a local church in making those types of decisions. Would it be better for us to take the Lord's Supper in smaller groups, like we see perhaps in Acts chapter 2? Would it be better for us to take the Lord's Supper all together, like you see perhaps in 1 Corinthians 11? What should we do? What is the wisest thing for our local church to do? Well, if everything is normal and we don't have to worry about local laws or local ordinances, or if we don't have to worry about a sickness, spreading into the whole group, it seems like the best thing to do in our culture and our circumstances, what used to be normal, our circumstances would be to come together. And we have a church building, and it's got plenty of space for people. It is laid out in a way so that you can take the supper, the Lord's Supper, together with a larger group of people. I mean, it's very accommodative to that. And so the wise thing seems to be in those circumstances, well, let's do it together. Well, now you have to shelter in place, and groups are limited to a certain size. It's going to change in the near future. I don't know what it is right now. But for a while it was 10, right? We were almost illegal, just our family, right? For a while it's 10. And so if that's limited, then the shepherds in Brentwood at least looked at the local ordinances and said, hey, there's something that is inhibiting us from meeting all together as one big group. So we're going to take the Acts 2 approach for a while. We're going to meet house to house. So get together with your family, maybe if there are some other people close by, and you can follow the ordinances for social distancing and all the things that were put in place. Maybe in a small group, as is appropriate, do it like that for a while. And the shepherds are still exercising oversight. They're still checking up on everybody. They're making sure that everyone is doing well. They're not just saying, go do whatever you want. They're still shepherding the people, but the way that has happened has changed a little bit. And so what I think you see in the biblical text is flexibility. Right? There might be times where you could get together as a big group. There might be times where you couldn't, or it wasn't the wisest thing to do for whatever reason. And well, right now, I don't think it's a wise thing to break the law just so that we can all get together as a group when the text of Scripture doesn't mandate that is the only way that can be done. And so I am very hesitant to create a rule that the Lord has not created. If God were to say somewhere, if we could turn somewhere in the Bible and it says, the Lord's Supper can only happen if the shepherds are present and at least 70% of the congregation is present, and they all have to be in one place. Well, then that would be the way we did it. But it's not there. And this flexibility allows the church to survive in times of persecution. It allows the church to adapt to different circumstances. When there are 3,000 people, 5,000 people at one point meeting in a pretty small area, it was just better for them to spread out, to do it house to house. And that's probably how they expected it should happen anyway, based off of the Passover meal. When you get to a place like Corinth, which is very wealthy, and you have people with much larger homes, maybe in Corinth it made more sense to all meet together. And so you see flexibility in the text of Scripture. And I'm very hesitant to make rules where God hasn't made rules. Right? And I think that is the crux of spiritual leadership, is to take the principles and the guidelines that God has given us, and where God is explicit, where God says this is the only way to do this, well, then that's the only way we do it. But where God gives us, options, where God doesn't limit something, then we need wise spiritual people to help us see the best way forward. What is the wisest way to implement the principles that God has given us? And I think that's an important aspect of spiritual leadership. Does that kind of make sense?
Definitely.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts to add to that before we move on to the next thing?
I think it was a good point to say that the flexibility has allowed Christianity to survive, to go on throughout time, because there's all these different circumstances that exist throughout history. But Christians, because there is some flexibility in God's commandments, they're able to fulfill what God wants, despite different circumstances.
Yeah.
They can still. It's neat to see that maybe God isn't always as rigid, as we think. He definitely has a standard, but at the same time, there is accommodation for different circumstances because God knows that there are going to be times of persecution, there's going to be times of hardship, struggle, and famine, and you may live remotely or whatever. And he in his wisdom allows Christianity to survive and flourish in all types of circumstances.
Yeah. So that very idea, we're going to look at that very idea. It's here in our text in 1 Corinthians. Okay, so I missed it by a verse. Let's try here. To the Jews, I became as a Jew. So this is 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 20. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. All right, so Paul is saying that there's flexibility, right? And so he uses his liberty as a Christian when he's talking to a Jewish person or trying to help a Jew find Jesus, a Hebrew person. He lives like they do. He eats what they eat. He dresses how they dress. He becomes like them. When he moves over and now he's dealing with a Gentile, he becomes like them. And so there's this flexibility. And I think that idea of flexibility, of freedom, the way that we talk to our children about what obedience is, one of the ways we describe obedience is the freedom to be creative with traditions. When we do something for a certain way for so long, we tend to think that that is the only way to do it. And that's not unique to us, right, today. That is humanity throughout history. Look at fashion. Right? Fashion. Nobody dresses like they did in the Victorian era any longer. I mean, maybe a reenactor might. But if you were to go to the grocery store and you saw somebody walking in a dress, a Victorian, high fashion Victorian dress, they would be out of place. What was that? You would admire it? They would be weird, right? They would be out of place. But we would think then, if we were from that era, we would think that dressing differently, well, this is the only way to dress. And we look at the way that we dress today, and we would think that, well, this is the only way to dress. And that's going to change throughout time. And the principles that are in place guide the way that the Lord's people behave within a set of principles, within a set of guidelines. The woman wearing the giant Victorian dress, the man in the three-piece suit and the bowler hat are living within the framework that God has given us, just like today, the guy walking down the aisle in the grocery store with shorts and a t-shirt is living within the framework of the guidelines that God has given us. But in the Victorian era, people would have thought he was in his underwear. And so it's, does that make sense? The manifestation of God's principles changes. The way we enact God's principles changes, but we still have those boundaries. And the fact that people wear t-shirts in public now doesn't mean that we think there's no rules for the way that we ought to exhibit ourselves in public. But it does mean that the way that we use those principles has been modified. It's changing. And so that's the hard thing, is that we've gotten used to meeting in a church building and everybody coming together in one place and everybody taking the Lord's Supper together. And so when that changes, we see the change in our tradition and we think it is a change in God's principles. And that's not always the case. Does that make sense? Okay.
We also have to realize it's not a change in our faithfulness either.
Yes, that's a good point.
We're still being faithful by, as we talked about before, by obeying the government and doing what we're asked to be doing at this time, and still devoting our time to God and to connecting with God's people and and participating in all the kinds of activities we would normally do. So we're not being, we're still doing those things to the best of our ability. We're still being faithful and remaining constant.
I'm glad that you made that distinction. That is an incredibly important distinction to make, right? We aren't just sitting at home saying, well, I mean, if I stay home, I can just watch television and take the Lord's Supper, right? That's not what is going on. At least that hopefully isn't what's going on. Right. And so that is another important thing, is that this is an act of faith, however it is done. I haven't seen any questions about it, but if you've got questions about the stuff we're talking about, feel free to send them in. Or if you have comments or insights or other passages that you want to bring up, feel free to always to send those in, because that's the goal, is to have a discussion, and you all very much are included and part of that discussion. We're going to move now to the next question. This has come up several times, and so it's probably something that we should look at, that we should consider. I've been asked by several people if I feel like these are signs of the end times. So with the coronavirus and a lot of the different things that we're seeing happening, are these signs of the end times? What is your initial reaction to that question?
I don't think that we ever know when the end is coming, so I guess I don't think about that idea a whole lot. I just try to think that it could come any day. Jesus can come back whenever the Father says. So I just try to think, we just need to be ready every day. I don't really think about that question a lot personally.
Yeah.
But I think that we need to every day be thinking, this will be the last day. I need to be telling people about Jesus. I need to be showing God's love to everyone. I need to be faithful to God in my heart. I need to be prayerful. We want the end to come. We pray for that to come, for Jesus to come. That's my personal thoughts.
Yeah, it's not something to be avoided, right? The word that is often used, like if you're reading a religious book, a word that might be used would be the parousia, and that if you ever hear that, it means like the second coming of Jesus. And so you'll hear people talk about the parousia, or they'll talk about the second coming. That's what we're discussing. That's what people mean, I think, when they say, are these the end times? Is they're asking about that. Is it the second coming? Is it the parousia? And that is an expectation that shows up in the biblical text. The writers in the New Testament, the Christians in the first century, expected there to be a return. At least one. And we say at least one because things are weird when you start talking about prophecies. It just gets weird. Like when you talk about the day of the Lord, how many days of the Lord are there? Do you happen to know off the top of your head?
No.
Tons. Right? Every time there's a big judgment and a deliverance, it's the day of the Lord. And there are many of those. There is also like one big ultimate end, day of the Lord. And that will be like the end, when the dead are raised and we stand before the Lord and you're parted to the right or the left, the sheep and the goats, and you stand before the judgment seat of Christ. That's coming. Right? So that is the day of the Lord. But so is every time God renders judgment or delivers people. Those tends to be the same day. Right? The day of judgment for one group or one person is the day of deliverance or salvation for another. When God brought Israel out of Egypt, it was a day of salvation for Israel, but it was a day of judgment for Egypt. And so those two things often go together, judgment and salvation, the day of the Lord. And so when we talk about this, there is this sense in which the day of the Lord happens continuously, many times. I don't mean like every single day, but many times throughout history. It has always been interesting to me that no matter when people were alive, from the time of Jesus, no matter when people were alive, they were able to look at the book of Revelation and they're able to say, this is happening today. Why do you think that's the case? And if you don't, go ahead.
Oh, it always can seem applicable to things that are going on in our life, you know.
Yes, yes. That is the nature of that book. We call it apocalyptic literature. It's a prophetic book. It's written just like the prophets. And in fact, John would be sued by Ezekiel and Zechariah and some of the other prophets. They'd be like, he stole my material. He did. I mean, he just lifted it out. And you see those things again. And the reason why he's doing that is John is connecting a lot of the dots for the believers in the first century. And if you want to understand the book of Revelation, the first thing you have to do is you have to go and become very well acquainted with the prophets, the major prophets and the minor prophets, all of them, because that is where John gets his material, is from the prophets. And when you look at the prophetic writings, right, you could take some of the prophecies in the prophetic writings from the Old Testament, and you could say, hey, this applies to today. And you're absolutely right, it would. That's why people can look at the book of Revelation and they can say, hey, this is talking about today. There's upheaval in governments. There's a sickness going around, a pandemic. There's threat of food shortages. There's locusts over in Africa. There's all of this craziness happening. What was that?
All the
yes.
The
yeah. Yeah. People look at it and they go, oh, this is talking about today. They're right. It is. But maybe not in the way they think. And so I don't think necessarily, right, with the caveat that I don't know when that last day of the Lord is coming. I don't know when. But the way the book of Revelation is written is it had a very particular meaning to the people in the first century. When John writes the book of Revelation, he says these things are going to happen soon. So there is a meaning in that book of soon. Something happened. The text of Revelation means something to the people who got it in the first century, and it was going to happen soon. Hey there, little ladybug. Hi. Well, so it meant something to them. But 200 years later, people take the book and they read through it and they're like, oh, this is happening today. It means something to them. 200 years after that, in 500 AD, people read it and they're like, oh, this is talking about today. In 1000 AD, it's actually 999. So in 999 AD, when the clock is about to tick over to 1000, people expected the universe to end. And they were looking everywhere and they saw all the signs and they're like, this is it. And they saw application for their lives that day. In 2000,
do you think that's probably on purpose?
I think it's absolutely on purpose. In 1999, when it was about to click over to 2000, which technically the new millennium doesn't start until 2001, but when it clicked over from 1999 to 2000, people were going crazy. It was the end of the world. We're all going to die. Not only Y2K, but I mean, we saw signs of the second coming everywhere. Right? I remember all kinds of biblical people were spouting prophecy. They were making predictions all the time. And I mean, we're still here 20 years later. Well, how come people can see Revelation in their own life? Why is that the case? Why do we see that in every generation? People think that Revelation is talking about their generation. The beast in the book of Revelation, I think, has been misidentified as Russia, as China, as the UN, as the Germans, as the French under Napoleon. Why is that the case? Why do you think that happens?
I would say just because we need to always be ready. God wants us to be looking for his coming. Is my thought.
Yeah. The idea of the second coming, of the judgment, is one that should always be at the forefront of our mind, because if I am to die before that final day of the Lord, the day that I die is the day of the Lord for me. As appointed unto man once to die, and after that comes judgment. Right? So when I die, that is the day of the Lord. I have to be ready for that. I have to make sure that I'm living faithfully, because I don't know when that event is going to happen. I don't know when Christ is going to return. I don't know when any of these things are going to happen. And so mercifully, the Lord has given us this book that is, I don't want to use the word cyclical, but this book that has signs and pictures in it that are applicable, right? We can look in the world around us today and we can see things happening, and it helps to open our eyes to spiritual realities. When we see earthquakes and storms and we see governments going to war and we see sickness spreading, that causes us to take a step back and go, wow, there are spiritual forces at play in the world all around me, and I know that's true because the book of Revelation talks about it. And now John may not have been talking specifically about what is going on between, the Middle Eastern states and Russia, between Saudi Arabia and Russia, or China and the United States. I don't think John is looking into the future and prognosticating those things, but I think that there is a type, an image that human history always fits within. And John is saying, when you see these things happening, this is spiritual warfare. This is the forces of good and evil going on, battling in a realm that you cannot see. But that spiritual reality is always true. And regardless of what it meant, right, regardless of what the book meant in the first century, and I have some ideas, but regardless of what it meant in the first century, when John said this is going to happen soon, regardless of the specific fulfillment, there is this prophetic fulfillment, this sense in which it fits in every time. Just like when you go to other places and you look at prophecies in the Bible, there are very specific fulfillments. When God told Abraham, you're going to have a child, and that child is going to form a nation, and that nation is going to go and get a land. Who was the specific child? Isaac. Yeah. Who is the specific nation?
The Jews.
Yeah, the Hebrew people. What is the specific land?
The land of Canaan, the promised land.
Yeah, the Levant, Canaan, whatever you want to call that region over there on the map. That was it. When those things were fulfilled, the specific fulfillment had been brought to pass, right? That was what was being talked about. But then that promise is repeated, right? It comes up again and again and again throughout the text of Scripture, and it finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus. Jesus is ultimately the child. The nation is ultimately the faithful people that have been gathered together to Christ. Ultimately, that nation, or that land, is our abode with the Lord, our dwelling place with the Lord. And so you see all these different ways in which that prophecy fits throughout time. There is a specific physical fulfillment, there is an ultimate fulfillment, and there is a bunch of little fulfillments all throughout. That's exactly what you see, I think, with other prophecies, with other prophets, and even with the book of Revelation. And so my ultimate answer would be, when you come to like Matthew chapter 24, when you look at Matthew chapter 24, I think the immediate context of Matthew 24 and the immediate context of Revelation, I think they're talking about the same things. And so Jesus comes out in Matthew 24 and he sees that somebody says, look at the temple, isn't it amazing? And Jesus says, do you see all these? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple, which happens in 70 AD. And then he goes to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples come to him and they're like, hey, what did you mean? Tell us when these things will be, right? When will these things happen? And Jesus says, see, so let's pick up here in verse 4. See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, and see to it that you are not alarmed, for this has to take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and all these are but the beginning of the birth pains. They will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Okay, so right now, pause. Who is going to be delivered up, and who is going to be put to death?
Disciples.
The disciples. So the immediate context of what Jesus is saying is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the persecution of those disciples. Now, are the Lord's disciples persecuted today?
Yes.
Absolutely. I think we